What did you say? Run it back. Ayana's voice was ice cold, a low growl of controlled fury as she pressed Officer Daniels against his patrol car. The streets were empty, dark except for the glow of a streetlight flickering above them. You thought my fiancé was some criminal to be disposed of, didn't you? Thought you could take him down without consequence? Officer Daniels' body trembled, his voice faltering as he stammered for words, his eyes darting nervously from side to side, looking for an escape that didn't exist. I didn't. You didn't think, did you? Ayana cut him off. Her hand was steady, not wavering an inch, as she held the gun in her palm, its weight a familiar reminder of what she was about to do. She had played by the rules for too long now. It was her turn to rewrite them. She wasn't just angry anymore. She was beyond that. She was calm and methodical, and this man was the first on her list to feel the weight of justice. The silencer on the gun muffled the shot, but his knees buckled all the same. He crumpled to the ground, the officer's body slumping against the cold concrete, his face pale in the harsh light of the street lamp. Ayana didn't flinch, didn't look away as she wiped the gun clean and tucked it back into her jacket. Her eyes were cold, unyielding. You thought you could kill a man like Malik and walk away? Thought the law would protect you? She stood over him, her gaze unblinking as the officer gasped for air. Her heart didn't race. It didn't need to. This was justice. The same justice Malik had been denied the moment those officers decided he wasn't worth protecting. Her fiancé had always been too good for a world that couldn't see him for what he was. A young man with dreams bigger than the streets he lived on. Dreams that had been shattered by a brutal, senseless act of police violence. And now, here she was, taking back what had been stolen from her, piece by piece. She didn't say another word as she turned and walked away, her steps sure and steady, her heart hardening with each passing second. This was the first of many steps, the first of many moments where the people who thought they were untouchable would learn that no one was safe. The streets were quiet as Ayana disappeared into the shadows. But her resolve was louder than any siren. The air felt too heavy in the small apartment, suffocating under the weight of unspoken words. Ayana sat in the corner, her fingers trembling as she curled them into a fist, pressing them against her lips to stifle the sob that threatened to escape. Malik's hospital bracelet was still wrapped tightly around her wrist, the metal cold against her skin, a painful reminder of everything they had lost. She had promised him, time and again, that nothing would take him from her. She had told him they would escape it all, the streets, the danger, the never-ending struggle to just survive. They had dreamed of a life outside of this place, a life where they didn't have to look over their shoulders, a life where they could build something for themselves, something real. But now, those dreams felt like they belonged to a different world, a world where her fiancé was still alive, a world where he didn't die that night. She closed her eyes, and the memories came rushing back, uninvited but unavoidable. It had been just another day. Malik had finished his practice, his long legs striding across the track with the kind of speed that had always amazed her. He was always so full of life, so full of promise. They had laughed about the race earlier that day, his voice light with excitement as he told her about the scholarship offers he had received. She had looked at him then, so full of hope, and she had known he was going places. She had known it, even when everyone else doubted him. "I'll make it out of here, Ayana," he'd said, breathless and smiling, after running his last lap. "You'll see. I'm going to leave this behind." And she had believed him. That night, she had kissed him goodbye, promised to cook their favorite dinner, fried chicken and mashed potatoes, and they planned to watch one of their old movies. It wasn't much, but to them, it was everything. She had always loved those small moments, the simplicity of them. And as he'd walked out the door, his bag slung over his shoulder, Ayana had smiled to herself, knowing the future Malik would create was just a matter of time. But that was before the sirens, before the lights, before everything went black. Ayana had been halfway through preparing dinner when her phone rang. She'd seen the caller ID and rushed to answer, her heart racing for reasons she couldn't explain. It was a neighbor. And it was the worst kind of call. "Ayana, they've got him. The police, they've got Malik. He's on the ground, and they're not letting him up. Her stomach dropped. Malik. She could barely hear the words over the pounding of her own heartbeat in her ears. What do you mean? What's going on? Ayana's voice had been thin, breaking as she forced herself to stand still. He's been thrown to the ground. They're not letting him move. They're hurting him. It was like the world tilted. Like the earth beneath her feet was giving way as she heard her neighbor's words. Hurt him? Malik? Her legs felt weak as she dropped the phone, not even bothering to put on shoes as she ran out the door. Every step felt like it took longer than the last. She barely registered the sounds of the city, the people walking past her, the honking cars. It was like everything had faded into the background, except for Malik. He was hers to protect, always had been. She had always been the one to keep him safe, to make sure he didn't fall into the traps that awaited every young man who looked. Like him in this city, she had made so many promises to him, promised she would keep him out of trouble, promised she would shield him from the streets and the cops that haunted their neighborhood. But now she was too late. She finally reached the corner where the lights from the police cars lit up the entire street, their glow reflected in the puddles that had formed from the earlier rain. There, in the middle of the street, Malik was on the ground, surrounded by 4 officers. They had him pinned down, his arms twisted behind him, his head pushed into the cold concrete. Ayana's heart stopped as she saw the blood. Her breath caught in her throat, her chest tightening as she watched the officers move around him, shoving his body further into the ground, their hands too rough, too forceful. She could see the panic in Malik's eyes, his mouth opening as if to speak, but nothing came out. What the hell are you doing? Ayana screamed as she rushed forward, but before she could take another step, one of the officers grabbed her arm and shoved her back. Stay back. It's under control. The officer shouted, but Ayana's eyes were fixed on Malik. She didn't hear anything else. She didn't care. The world moved in slow motion as she struggled to break free from his grip. The officers hadn't even bothered to explain. They hadn't said a word. Malik was just another black boy on the ground to them. A threat to be disposed of, no different than any other. Her legs gave way as she dropped to her knees. Malik. Her voice was raw, but he didn't respond. He couldn't. The officers had taken everything from him. She had tried. She had tried to keep him safe. But now, the world had stolen him from her dot when the ambulance arrived. They hadn't been able to do much. The blood had poured out of him too fast. The damage was too severe. By the time they rushed him into the E, his body had gone cold. Ayana was left standing there, shaking, her hands empty, her future slipping away with every second. The doctors had done their best, but there had been no hope. Malik was gone. The world that had been so bright for him, the world they had planned to escape, had already swallowed him whole. But Ayana hadn't given up. She hadn't walked away. Not then, not now. Malik would not be forgotten. The streetlights outside flickered in her memory as she sat by his bed, waiting for him to wake up, hoping against hope that he would pull through. But the truth was slowly sinking in. The doctors could give him all, the machines in the world, but they couldn't give him back what the officers had taken. Her fingers brushed the hospital bracelet around her wrist, a small piece of Malik's life she could hold on to, but it felt like a chain. And she was no longer bound by it. She would never be the same. Ayana had always been the kind of person who believed that change was possible. Hope had been her driving force, even when the world around her seemed to be pulling in the opposite direction. She was the one people turned to when they needed a voice, someone to stand up for them when they were too tired or afraid to speak for themselves. And she didn't just talk about change, she made it happen. She fought for the community, for justice, for the children, who deserved a chance to make it out, to live a life different from the one she and Malik had fought to escape. Before the attack, before Malik had been taken from her in the most brutal way imaginable, Ayana had been at the forefront of a movement, pushing for equal rights, for a better future. She organized marches, led campaigns, and fought hard to make sure that the voices of her people were heard. She was a community organizer, a woman who believed in the power of unity and the strength of collective action. She had known that the streets were dangerous, had seen the damage they did to her friends and family. But she had believed there was always hope, always a way to rise above. Her work had given her purpose, filled her with pride. She was making a difference, even if the world didn't always see it. And she'd had Malik by her side through it. All, the two of them as a team, both determined to leave the world better than they had found it. But that night, the night everything changed, Ayana's dreams, her future, her entire world, had crumbled in an instant. It had started like any other evening. She had spent the afternoon going door to door, checking in with residents in the neighborhood, listening to their concerns, and offering resources for anyone who needed them. She had always felt connected to the people she helped, understood their struggles in a way that made her want to keep fighting. They weren't just statistics to her, they were family. Each conversation was a small victory, a little step toward making a bigger impact. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, Ayana was exhausted but satisfied. Malik had been waiting for her, as always. They had a small dinner planned, takeout from their favorite spot, and a quiet evening in front of the TV. She hadn't expected the phone call that would change everything. The night had seemed peaceful. At first, like any other. She had been in the kitchen when her phone buzzed, an unfamiliar number flashing on the screen. Her heart skipped a beat as she picked up, a sinking feeling creeping into her chest before she even said hello. Double quotes, a Y-A-N-A. You need to get to Malik. The police. Her blood ran cold as the words barely registered. What do you mean? What's happening? He's been stopped by the police. He's on the ground. They've got him. What? What do you mean? What's going on? The voice on the other end had been shaky, panicked, but that was all Ayana needed to hear. Malik. Her Malik. She knew. Her feet moved before her brain could catch up, her hands shaking as she dropped the phone. She didn't grab her jacket, didn't stop to think. She just ran. The streets seemed to stretch out in front of her, too long, too empty. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears as she made her way to the scene. Every step felt like an eternity, but she couldn't stop. She had to reach him. She had to get to Malik. When she arrived, the sight that greeted her was enough to make her blood run cold. The flashing lights of multiple police cruisers illuminated this street like a horror movie scene, but it wasn't a movie. It was real. Her fiancé, the man she loved, was on the ground, surrounded by officers. She could barely make out his face from where she stood, but she didn't need to see him clearly to know what was happening. She could see the brutality in their stance, the way they held him down like an animal. Her heart pounded in her chest. As she pushed forward, her voice breaking through the night air as she shouted for them to stop, to get off him. She knew Malik. He wouldn't fight back. He wasn't the kind of person who would escalate a situation, especially not with the police. He just wanted to get home. But as she got closer, the sight of the officers making no effort to de-escalate the situation, instead slamming him harder into the ground, made the anger rise inside her, sharp and hot. What are you doing to him? She screamed, her voice raw. What's your problem? But the officers didn't stop. Instead, one of them turned to face her, his expression dismissive. Stay back, he barked, his hand reaching for his belt, the unmistakable sign of a weapon. Ayana didn't back down. Don't you dare. Don't touch him, Malik. Her world blurred as her vision narrowed to her fiancé. His eyes were wide, full of confusion and fear, but no one was listening. No one cared. Her voice echoed in her ears, growing desperate as she ran forward, but she was stopped. Hands grabbed her, pulling her back with an aggression that knocked the breath out of her. Get off me, she shouted, but the officer only gripped her tighter, throwing her against the side of a police car. She couldn't move fast enough. Malik was slipping away, his body going still under the weight of those who had sworn to serve and protect him. The scene had been chaotic. The other officers didn't hesitate as they continued to hold him down, pressing his head into the asphalt, until it sunk into the ground. That was when it happened. The moment she couldn't unsee, couldn't erase from her mind. Malik stopped moving. His body went still, the sounds of his breathing becoming shallow. The officers had broken him. They had taken everything from her in that instant. She didn't need to see the official report to know what had happened. She didn't need to hear their excuses. She already knew. No. She screamed, her voice cracking as the reality of what had happened hit her like a freight train. When the paramedics arrived, it was already too late. Malik wasn't breathing on his own. He had been suffocated by the weight of the men who had been sworn to protect him. Her fiancé, the one person she had trusted the most in the world, was gone, taken by the hands of those who were supposed to serve. The aftermath was a blur. The hospital, with its sterile smell, had done nothing to ease the raw pain in her chest. She had watched Malik fight, but for what? The doctors had told her what she already knew. The damage was too great. Malik wouldn't wake up. That it wasn't just the loss that had broken Ayana, it was the betrayal. The system that was supposed to keep them safe had failed her in the worst possible way. She had trusted them. She had believed in the idea of justice, that it was meant for everyone. But it had never been meant for people like Malik. Her anger swelled inside her, mixing with the hurt, and it was then that the seed of vengeance had been planted. This wasn't going to be over just because they had killed him. This wasn't the end. The video footage from the police body cameras had surfaced the next day. Footage that showed the officer's brutality in full, capturing every moment of Malik's suffering. The images flooded the media, spreading across news stations and social media platforms like wildfire. The footage showed Malik's hands trembling as they slammed him to the ground. It showed him trying to fight for air, trying to breathe as the weight of the officers crushed him. The truth was undeniable, and yet the system tried to ignore it. The DA, the same ones who promised to protect the people, had already begun to sweep it under the rug. Insufficient evidence. They said it wasn't enough to convict. They said there were too many gray areas. Malik's life, his future, had been reduced to a statistic. The betrayal cut deeper than anything Ayana had ever felt, and that was when it hit her. The realization that this fight, this mission, was no longer just about Malik. It was about something bigger. It was about making sure that nothing like this ever happened again. Ayana had been part of the system once, had believed in it once. But now, it was time to make them feel what she felt, to make them hurt the way she had been hurt. The streets would remember Malik's name, and Ayana would make sure of it. The silence that hung in the room felt like a physical weight, pressing down on Ayana's chest as she sat alone in her apartment, the night air cool against her skin as she stared out the window. Malik's hospital bracelet was still wrapped tightly around her wrist, though its coldness now felt like a reminder of everything she had lost. The dim light of the streetlights outside illuminated the room, casting long shadows that mirrored. The way she felt inside haunted, incomplete, but clear. She had tried to play by the rules. She had believed in justice, in the system, in the idea that the law would protect people like Malik. But now, as she sat there, staring at the empty space where Malik's smile should have been, she understood something deeper. The system had failed. The officers who had done this to him were still walking free, still getting away with murder, and they would continue to do so unless she did something about it. Ayana's hands were shaking, but not from fear, not anymore. The grief had settled into something else now, something colder and more dangerous. Anger, rage, vengeance. It was all too clear now. She couldn't wait for the authorities to do what they should have done. They hadn't. They wouldn't. So it was up to her. She didn't have the luxury of waiting for the DA or the police to suddenly find their conscience. They had already proven that their promises meant nothing. That meant the only option left was to take matters into her own hands. She thought back to the days when Malik had been alive, when he would come home after a long day of practice, exhausted but smiling, his excitement for the future contagious. He'd had so much potential, so many dreams. And now, those dreams were lying in the sterile white of a hospital room. Those dreams had been crushed by the same system that was supposed to protect him. Her heart clenched, and a single tear slipped down her cheek. But it wasn't for him anymore. It was for herself. The grief, the helplessness, it had all transformed into something sharper, something dangerous. She couldn't let him die like this. Her hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. This wasn't about justice anymore. This wasn't even about revenge. This was about making them pay. The officers who had taken her fiancé from her, they needed to feel the weight of their actions. They needed to understand that there were consequences for what they had done. Her phone buzzed on the table, interrupting the quiet storm of thoughts swirling in her mind. She glanced at the screen and saw a name she hadn't expected to see in months. Spade. Spade had been a former ally, someone who knew the streets better than anyone. A guy with connections to underground networks that existed outside the reach of the law. Once upon a time, Ayana had worked with him on community outreach programs. Back then, it had been about peace and progress. But now, the streets weren't about peace anymore. They were about war. She picked up the phone, her finger hovering over the screen as she debated for a moment. Then, with a breath, she answered, "You still in town?" Spade's voice came through, low and steady, as if he already knew the kind of conversation this was going to be. "Yeah, I need your help," Ayana replied, her voice unwavering. "I'm going after them." There was a moment of silence on the other end. "You sure about this?" Spade finally asked, his tone a mix of caution and understanding. He knew how deep the waters were that Ayana was about to step into. He knew what this kind of decision meant. "I'm done waiting," she said, her voice firm. "They think they can take everything from me and walk away. I'm not going to let that happen." Spade sighed, a sound that told her he wasn't surprised, but that he knew the gravity of her decision. "All right. I'll get the crew together. You're going to need more than just a gun for this." "I know. I've already got a plan." Ayana had already begun to think through every step of her plan. The first part had been easy. She had taken her first shot. It had felt like she was finally doing something. But this wasn't a single move. This was going to be a full-scale operation. The officers responsible for Malik's beating, they weren't just going to disappear. No, Ayana had a more precise plan for them. She couldn't just eliminate the corrupt cops one by one. She needed to hit them where it hurt. She needed to take out the entire network, the system they had built, the structure that protected them from accountability. So Ayana made a call. She reached out to those who had helped her before, to old allies and some people she'd never met, but knew through the connections Malik had once built in the community. She was going after the officers, but she was also going after the corruption that enabled them. And this time, she wasn't going to be careful. She wasn't going to sit back and hope for justice. She was going to make it happen. Spade called her a few hours later. "We're in," he said. "Jello's on the tech, Tiny's ready to move, and I've got eyes on the targets. You ready for this?" Ayana didn't answer immediately. She just stood up, walked over to the window, and stared out at the city. The lights flickered in the distance, a soft glow against the night. For a second, she felt a pang of doubt. What was she doing? But then she thought of Malik. She thought of his face in the hospital bed, the way he had looked at her before the machines had taken over. She thought of how they had tried to silence him, how they had treated him like nothing. And then, without hesitation, she dialed Spade's number again. "Let's do it." Her plan wasn't rushed. Ayana didn't make impulsive decisions. She had watched the way the system worked, their patterns, the places they went, the secrets they thought were hidden. Every officer who had been part of Malik's assault had a life outside of their uniforms. They had families, they had friends, they had their own weaknesses. Spade and his crew had a list. It wasn't just about tracking the officers down one by one. Ayana had bigger targets in mind. The police chief who had covered it up, the DA who had decided Malik's life wasn't worth prosecuting. She was going to bring the whole corrupt system down around them. Every officer had someone they were connected to, someone they trusted. And Ayana knew how to leverage those connections. She had learned to be patient, to use everything she had at her disposal. The plan had to be flawless. She couldn't afford any mistakes. They couldn't afford to get sloppy-dot as Jello worked through his network. Ayana sat down with her own team, drawing out a map of the city. "We start with the weak points," she said. "The DA's office, the cops with the biggest ties to corruption. We hit them all at once." Her hands moved across the map, outlining the places where she knew they could hit the hardest. "We'll make sure they can't hide." The next few days were filled with action, quiet, deliberate, calculated moves. Tiny was on the ground, shadowing their targets, making sure they were never too far out of reach. Jello worked the phones, tracing bank accounts and phone records, pulling files that had been buried under layers of bureaucracy. And Ayana? She was overseeing it all, making sure each piece fell into place, one by one. She hadn't just become a woman out for revenge. She had become the architect of their downfall. Each movement was more precise than the last. The closer they got, the more confident Ayana became. The grief that had once choked her throat was now transformed into purpose. She had a goal. She wasn't going to let the system take her fiancé from her without payback. The final piece of the puzzle came when Ayana received the phone call. "We're ready." Spade's voice was calm, but Ayana could hear the undertone of excitement. They were about to make their first move. The storm was coming. Her heart raced as she gathered the team together, making final preparations. This wasn't just about Malik anymore. This was about taking down the entire corrupt system. And Ayana was going to lead the charge. With the weight of the gun in her hand, Ayana felt ready. This was what she had been waiting for. The final act of defiance. And she would make them remember. The rain had started to fall just as Ayana stepped out of the car, her boots making a soft thud as they hit the pavement. The city had a different feel tonight, a kind of heaviness in the air, as if the streets themselves knew something was about to change. The streets had always been quiet at night, but tonight they felt like they were holding their breath, waiting for the storm to break. Ayana didn't have time to waste on the rain. The only thing she could focus on was the man ahead of her, the one officer she had been tracking for weeks. Officer Martin Keller. He had been one of the officers who had assaulted Malik, the one who had been at the front of the pack, shouting orders, holding Malik down while the others took their turns. She had his face burned into her memory, his voice still echoing in her head from that night, his eyes cold and indifferent as they crushed Malik's body under their weight. She knew everything about him now. She knew where he lived. She knew the routes he drove. She knew his habits. And she knew exactly where he was tonight. This was the moment she'd been waiting for. The restaurant was small, tucked away on a corner, just off the main strip, with dim lights and a quiet, almost cozy atmosphere. From the outside, it looked completely harmless. But Ayana knew better. Keller was in there right now, having dinner, thinking he was safe, thinking the world had forgotten about what happened to Malik. She was about to show him just how wrong. He was. Her hand brushed against the side of her jacket, feeling the cold steel of the gun tucked into her holster. It had been with her every step of the way since that night, the night she had lost everything. It had become an extension of herself, a reminder that her anger had turned into something more. A weapon. She pushed open the door, the bell above it ringing softly as she entered. The warmth of the restaurant hit her immediately, a stark contrast to the cold, wet world outside. She scanned the room quickly, her eyes moving over the few scattered patrons, and then locking in on Keller, sitting alone at a table near the back. He was laughing, his voice too loud for the setting, oblivious to the storm that was about to descend on him. His back was to her, which was exactly what she wanted. This was it. Ayana took a steadying breath, her mind already calculating her next steps. She walked across the room slowly, purposefully, her steps quiet on the wood floors. She wasn't rushing. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. She had done everything to prepare for this. Every move had been calculated, down to the smallest detail. She wasn't going to let her anger control her. She had worked too hard for that. This moment wasn't about rage. It was about taking control. She stopped just behind Keller's chair, her presence now impossible for him to ignore. "Well, if it isn't Officer Keller." Her voice was calm, measured, too calm for what she was about to do. But it had to be this way. She couldn't let him see how much this moment meant to her. Not yet. Keller stiffened, his laughter faltering as he turned slowly to look at her. His eyes took a moment to focus, clearly not expecting anyone, especially not someone like her. But when he saw her, his expression changed immediately. The smug confidence faded, replaced by something else, something she could almost taste. In the air, he stood up quickly, But Ayana was already a step ahead of him. She reached for his arm, her fingers gripping it tight, stopping him from moving. "Sit down, Martin. You and I have some unfinished business." He froze, his body going tense, and for the first time, Ayana saw the flicker of fear in his eyes. It was almost too satisfying. He knew who she was. He knew why she was here. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice shaky, no longer the confident officer who had ordered Malik's beating. He was just a man now, scared and vulnerable, staring at the woman whose life he had destroyed. Ayana didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a step back, giving him space to breathe. But she didn't let him out of her sight. She was in control now. Her gaze never wavered as she spoke. "I want you to understand something," she said softly, almost casually. Your team, you thought you could just walk away after what you did to Malik. But you're wrong. You're not walking away from this. You're going to feel the same fear you made him feel." Keller's face paled as he began to back away, his mind racing. But Ayana's next move was swift. She stepped forward, placing the gun on the table, its cold barrel pointing directly at him. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with tension. "You're going to tell me everything. About the attack. About your involvement. About the system that's covering this up." The tension in the air was unbearable now. Keller swallowed hard, his hands trembling as they reached for the edge of the table. For a moment, Ayana wondered if he would try to fight back. But he didn't. He couldn't. The fear in his eyes was palpable, and she could feel it. He was trapped. He sat back down slowly, trying to regain his composure, but Ayana could see right through it. The man who had taken Malik's future away was now nothing more than a coward, desperate to save his own skin. "I didn't do anything," Keller said, but his voice lacked the conviction it had when he was ordering the assault on Malik. Now, he sounded like a man grasping for any excuse to get out of this. Ayana's patience was wearing thin. She leaned forward, her face inches from his. "You're going to tell me what happened that night. And you're going to tell me everything you've been hiding. Otherwise, I'll make sure you never see the light of day again." The words came out slow, but there was no mistaking the resolve in them. Keller's eyes flicked to the gun on the table, then back to her face, the fear mounting. He was already cracking that, and when the truth spilled out, Ayana listened, every word burning like fire in her chest. She didn't care how hard he tried to lie, how much he shifted the blame. She knew the truth. And for the first time since Malik had been attacked, Ayana felt a sense of power surge through her, something that felt like justice. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. The fallout from the confrontation, this confrontation didn't end in the way Ayana had anticipated. She had hoped it would be a moment of catharsis, a small victory in the war she was fighting. But it wasn't just one man she was dealing with. Keller's confession had been just the beginning. She had thought that bringing him to the edge would make him break. She had thought that, once he was exposed, the floodgates would open. But instead, Keller had gone quiet. The leak had already begun. By the time Ayana returned home, news of the confrontation had already spread like wildfire. The footage from the restaurant's security cameras had made it online, showing the officer cowering in front of her, visibly shaken, and finally admitting to his role in Malik's assault. It wasn't just a moment of weakness. It was the beginning of a storm. The city was watching. People had begun to rally behind Ayana, their voices growing louder. The truth was out there now, and it was too big to ignore. But the authorities weren't blind. They knew what Ayana was doing. They knew she had started a war. The police force, the DA, and even the media outlets that had turned a blind eye to Malik's death were scrambling now. The public's response was swift. People were angry. They wanted answers. And now, Ayana was the one giving them as the numbed. Days went by. The tension escalated. The police force was on edge, the pressure mounting. They tried to quiet the leak, to control the narrative, but it was too late. Ayana had thrown a stone into the river, and now the ripples were spreading. Ayana had expected the backlash. She knew the system would try to crush her. They would come for her, but she wasn't backing down. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. The more they tried to silence her, the louder she would become. And as she sat by her window, watching the chaos unfold in the streets below, she realized that the war she had started had only just begun. The streets were watching. And so was Malik. The night air was thick with anticipation, the city holding its breath as Ayana stood outside the police station, watching the flashing lights in the distance. It had all led to this moment. Every move she had made, every connection she had built, every ounce of rage she had turned into action. It had been a long, hard road, but the end was in sight. Tonight, she was going to take down the one person who was responsible for everything. The officer who had led the assault on Malik, the one who had crushed the life out of him before anyone had a chance to stop it. Officer Keith Reynolds, the one who had barked the orders, who had taken pleasure in Malik's pain, and who had never been held accountable for his actions. Ayana's fingers brushed against the cold metal of the gun. At her waist, the weight of it familiar, but no less significant. She had used it before, but tonight felt different. This was the final strike, the one that would take down the heart of the corruption. Tonight, Reynolds wouldn't walk away. She had planned every step. Spade and Tiny were in position, ready to make their move the second she gave the signal. Jella was monitoring the security cameras, making sure they had every angle covered. The pieces of the puzzle were in place, and she was about to make the final move. But it wasn't just about taking Reynolds down. It was about making sure the message was loud and clear. The system that had failed Malik, that had protected men like Reynolds, was going to crumble. It was going to burn. And Ayana was going to be the one to set the fire. She took a deep breath, her mind calm despite the chaos building inside her. This wasn't just about vengeance anymore. It was about something much bigger, justice, in the purest sense. She wasn't going to let him get away with it. Not this time. She looked around one last time. The area was empty, no one in sight. The night was quiet, but the tension in the air felt suffocating. "Let's do this," she whispered to herself, a single word that carried the weight of everything she had lost. Ayana walked through the shadows, her footsteps silent on the wet pavement as she made her way toward the entrance of the police station. Reynolds was inside, surrounded by his colleagues, under the false sense of security that nothing would happen to him. But Ayana knew better. The moment she stepped into that building, his life would change. The rules would no longer apply to him. She paused just outside the door, her breath steady, her heart pounding in her chest. She could already see it in her mind, the scene she had replayed over and over again. She would walk in, straight to Reynolds' office, where he thought he was safe. And then he would face her. She stepped inside, the door creaking slightly as she pushed it open. The smell of stale coffee and paperwork filled the air, the sounds of phones ringing and murmurs of conversation drifting through the station. But the moment Ayana entered, everything shifted. The atmosphere changed. A few officers looked up, startled by her presence, but none of them moved. They didn't know who she was yet, didn't realize that the woman standing in front of them was the one who had brought their worst nightmare to life. Ayana didn't waste any time. She made her way straight down the hallway, past the desks, ignoring the whispers and the eyes that followed her. The tension in the air thickened with each step she took. She could feel the eyes of the officers on her, but she didn't look back. When she reached the door to Reynolds' office, she didn't hesitate. She pushed it open, stepping inside without a word. Reynolds looked up, his expression momentarily confused before it morphed into something else. Recognition followed by fear. His chair creaked as he stood, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun at his side. But Ayana was faster. "Don't," she said, her voice calm but deadly. "I'm not here to negotiate." Reynolds' eyes flicked to the gun she held in her hand, his face paling as he realized what was about to happen. He reached for his phone, his fingers trembling. "You don't want to do this," he started, his voice shaking. But Ayana cut him off with a sharp movement of her hand. "I'm not here for your excuses," she said coldly. "You took my fiancé from me. You took everything from me. And now you're going to pay." For a moment, neither of them moved. The tension in the room was unbearable, like a live wire about to snap. And then, with a sudden movement, Reynolds lunged for his desk, his hand reaching for something hidden inside. Ayana's instincts kicked in before he could grab it. She fired. The shot was quick. Precise. Reynolds fell back against his chair, his hand dropping uselessly to the floor. His eyes went wide, disbelief written across his face. But the pain was immediate. The wound wasn't fatal, not yet, but it was enough to incapacitate him. Ayana stepped forward, her eyes never leaving him. "You thought you could just walk away, didn't you?" she asked, her voice low, her rage simmering just beneath the surface. "Thought I'd forget? Thought the system would protect you?" Reynolds couldn't speak. His breath came in shallow gasps, his eyes wide with panic as he realized how far this had gone. This was it. This was the moment where everything changed. The system was crumbling, and Ayana was the one who had torn it apart. By the time Ayana left the police station, everything had already started to unravel. Her confrontation with Reynolds wasn't just a single moment of catharsis. It was the spark that set the entire system ablaze. The news spread like wildfire, faster than Ayana had ever anticipated. The video of the confrontation, captured by the station's security cameras, had already made its way online. The footage showed Reynolds, shaking and terrified, admitting to his role in Malik's assault, his confession a clear and undeniable piece of evidence. The city watched in shock as the truth came to light, but it wasn't just Reynolds who was exposed. The entire department was being torn apart, piece by piece. The officers involved in the attack on Malik were now in the public eye, their names and faces plastered across every news station and social media feed. The corrupt system that had protected them for so long was finally being dismantled, and the public response was loud. People rallied in the streets, demanding justice, demanding accountability. The city that had once turned a blind eye to the abuses of power was now awake, enraged, and ready to fight back. Ayana had done what the system couldn't. She had brought the truth to light, and now the city had no choice but to face it. But Ayana knew the fallout wouldn't stop there. The police force, desperate to maintain control, began to tighten their grip. They started looking for Ayana, hunting her down, trying to stop the wave of truth she had set in motion. They were scared. They knew what she had started, and they were afraid. But Ayana didn't flinch. She couldn't. Not now. Not after everything she had done. The power she had ignited in the streets, the voices that were rising in unison against. The corruption was more than she had ever dreamed possible. But at what cost? Ayana sat alone in her apartment once more, the weight of the gun still heavy at her side. The adrenaline had worn off, and now the silence of the room was deafening. Her mind replayed everything, the confrontation with Reynolds, the look in his eyes when he realized he had no escape, the way the system had crumbled around her. She had done what she set out to do. Malik had been avenged. The officers who thought they were untouchable had been brought to their knees. The system had been shattered, and the truth had been exposed. But even as she sat there, the satisfaction of her victory felt distant, hollow. She had won, yes, but in doing so, she had become a part of the very system she had fought against. She had used violence to get what she wanted. She had become the force she once fought against. And no matter how much she justified it, no matter how much she told herself it was worth it, a part of her knew she had lost something along the way. She had avenged Malik, but the cost of that vengeance was something she couldn't fully comprehend yet. The city had changed, but so had she.